Hello, friends. Welcome to Liberation Lectionary. We are on episode 8 for the 10th Sunday after Pentecost. I'm Francisco Garcia with you here, hanging out in the South. And I got my good pal, comrade, fellow troublemaker.
I'm Jaime Edwards Acton, out here in Los Angeles, Episcopal priest, and as Francisco said, fellow troublemaker.
And so we are continuing on our journey through the Gospel of Matthew, looking at and reflecting on and ripping apart or deepening our understanding of these scriptures, but always through the lens. And the lens for us is the lens of liberation. We think that's where all the work of the gospel flows from. And so we are looking at Matthew 14, verses 22 through 23, short and sweet, but also pretty powerful. So Jaime is going to take it away with reading, and we're going to get into it.
Yeah, thanks, Francisco. So this is Matthew 14, 22 through 33. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ. So I don't know about you, Jaime, but I think Jesus is tired. I think it's important that we think about this text, obviously always in the context, both the social context, the political context of what was happening, and the literally chronological context as we see the story playing out. And we're just coming out of the story from last week, which is the feeding of the 5,000 plus and the healing of people who had been sick. So Jesus had been in the midst of these crowds that were desperation, right? And in serious need of some healing and some sustenance, some food in their bellies and in their souls. And that had happened right after John the Baptist. You hit the news of John the Baptist being assassinated by the state. And so Jesus has been at this work, healing and engaging in his work of ministry. He keeps trying to find time to grieve or to meditate or to pray. And so I think it's important that we kind of lift up that aspect of the work as he's committed to this work of liberation, of healing and wellness. He's just trying to find a spot to pray. And so I think it's important that we start with that. Yeah. He dismissed the crowds. He went up to the mountain to pray. And even then, the stuff caught up with him. And isn't that what happens to us, in our lives?
That's right. I mean, not only dismiss the crowd and he goes away to pray, but, a more kind of a longer term strategy for getting that self-care, perhaps, is he made the disciples get in the boat. And if I remember, we're both talking about how we didn't have a lot of prep time on this one, but I think I recall it being more like he forced them into the boat, right? And there is this sense that Jesus is eager for the disciples to grow up, right? To become more mature in their faith and more mature in their, what they're about. And they get in this boat together. And this boat is a clear metaphor for, the church or the movement, and they're sent away. They're forced into the boat, and they're sent away from land. Everything that's familiar and sturdy, even though these are fishermen, many of them, land is still, a safer bet. And but nevertheless, Jesus, partially probably in an effort to just get some me time, is, dismisses the crowd, sends them out, right, and then goes off and prays. But I think this sending off too is really trying to get them to not just grow up, but to embrace their agency, right? To embrace their capacity and to embrace wholeheartedly all the possibilities that God has instilled in them and has given them by their birthright. And the thing that they lack is the confidence, not just in Jesus, but the ye of little faith is a faith in yourselves too, right? I mean, so it's they're lacking that confidence and faith in what they're capable of here. So that stood out as to me, and I love this very parental image of Jesus sending that boat off into the wind and waves, and which must have been scary as heck. So
Yeah, I just think that, yeah, that idea of agency amongst the disciples, Jesus keeps coming back to that in lots of different ways, right? He was dealing with that in the last story about the feeding of the disciples, when they were doubting, that they're like, we have nothing, what are we going to do? And it's like, let's see what we have, right? There's enough, and let's work. You can work on this, trust me, right? And so he keeps trying to do that. And so, like, yeah, send them off for a while. Well, I'm going to go just take, I'm going to take a breather and refill my own, my own well, and come back. And then he comes back to this, this mess. And but I think that it points to how ministry, if we think about the work of ministry, it is like this. It is sort of like this back and forth of being deep in the work, and sometimes there doesn't seem like there's a way out, and it could be because the folks, your context, there's just so much need, or it's because you just feel like you're overcommitted and you can't find a way.
yeah,
And so sometimes it's because of the circumstances. Sometimes we do it to ourselves.
right, yeah,
And I think, being mindful of this long haul work of liberation, it's not an automatic thing. It's not a sprint, and finding the right amount of balance between that, I think, is important in the work of liberation.
yeah, and acknowledging that, a sign of the work is realizing that there will be, that there are waves, there will be tempestuous seas, there will be wind against you, right? You will be battered by the wind and the waves. And I love this image, and it becomes, in the context of, in Jesus's day, there's still the thinking of, the sea being, a kind of a mysterious kind of a lot of negative kind of forces, powerful forces, monsters, and Leviathan, and all kind of you creating this tempest and this storm and this wind and everything. And as we know, in other parts of Scripture, Old and New Testament, that these sea monsters, Leviathan, symbolize imperial forces, right? And forces of destruction and oppression, and whether it be the Babylonian Empire or the Roman Empire. And so you get this sense that this is Matthew trying to preach to the choir, right? And in wonderful coded kind of story, right, and metaphor about where to find Jesus in the midst of when you find yourself in a in an occupied, you're in your own land, but it's occupied by imperial forces, and you're trying to fight for freedom and liberation, and it's not easy. It's not easy, and And at the same time, you've got Jesus, saying, I'm not going to necessarily do it for you, right? I'm not going to do this work for you. And so the disciples find themselves, in this situation where, on the other hand, they're thrust into these situations and feel, might be feeling alone. But that's as we see as the story progresses, it's the last thing that's going on, that they're alone. They just don't realize what's going on yet. So,
Yeah, and even in the midst of that, of this whole story, sometimes we focus on the miraculous nature of Jesus walking on the water, right? And we lose sight of some we were talking about this earlier, but some tender moments in this story, almost like these parental
mm-hmm.
or moments that Jesus engages with with the disciples when they're afraid. Take heart, don't be afraid. um, I'm here, right? I got you, and God's got us, and even in the midst of this storm, there will be calm, right? And the storm rages at night, and one of the psalms says, psalms say that there's joy in the morning, right? And
Right.
so we have to remember that there is a rhythm of life, and even when things are really tough and seem like there is no way, um, it just can't last like that forever, right? And so we gotta know that there are rhythms. And so if we think about this in the sense of our justice work, I think it's the same thing, right? We see there was this huge moment, which we're just kind of just barely on the other side of it, right? um, where protest is happening day and night, around an issue, and with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others. And the protest hasn't subsided, we know that. But the I think the certain upsurge, right, when it was sort of like the daily and the nightly thing, and when the wave that happened when people were seeing, like, more confrontational sort of protest or other actions and things of that nature. That stuff we know subsides, and then we go back to the deeper work of who's on the ground, who's been on the ground, who's organizing, who's taking that righteous anger and continuing to channel it to create change and transformation, right? To organize and to fight the injustices that are so deep seated. And so
Right.
I think that's kind of what I see happening even where I am right now in Nashville. There's a coalition of folks that are working on some really important issues. Everything from how to keep people from getting evicted, right? How to prolong the access to economic relief and unemployment benefits, to organizing for more longer change around police budgets.
Yeah. Yeah. I like this. I like that kind of, that, like, where's this, when people do the work for the long haul, they, we always have these wonderfully surprising moments that the disciples are having here. I guess what I want to say is I find it so interesting and funny that they're surprised to find Jesus in the midst of the work, is how I want to say it. You know what I mean? They don't believe. That's not like the first thought that comes to their mind, that Jesus is going to be here with us in the midst of this hard work. And I love how they're surprised, or they think they're terrified first, but they're surprised that it's Jesus. Um, and I think that part of this story is to move from being surprised, like shocked that Jesus is in the midst of that hard work for the long haul, and to kind of expect it. How do we move from being surprised to expecting it, and how would that change our actions, right? Like, and Peter kind of tests this, right? He's testing this a little bit as he gets out on the water. Now, he doesn't necessarily pass this test with flying colors, right? But at least he gets out of that boat and he tests, right? That what would it be like to be in the midst of this chaos and to have confidence that that's really Jesus there, right? And that Jesus is in the midst of this, and so he's in, and Jesus says, "Well, you can, one way to find out, and so he does step out, and he's kind of, I give him maybe a C plus or something like that on this, but then there's something beautiful. You talk about the tender moments. It's the next thing that happens, which becomes iconic for me in this passage. The image, the iconic image for me in this passage is not Jesus walking on top of the water, right? Which could be powerful symbolically, politically, anyways. But it's this where as Matthew stumbles, spiritually, and stumbles physically, right? That this immediately there's this gesture, this hand reaching toward him, right? And that image becomes kind of the icon of our faith in the midst of hard times, in enduring times, troubled times, is believing that that hand will always be there, outstretched, ready to kind of, come on, we can do this next mile. Let's do this next mile together. I love that.
Yeah. And I mean, if we look at that statement that Jesus says with what you said earlier, that Jesus is not, because it's coupled with that statement before it, where Jesus reaches out his hand and catches him and then says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" It's not that I think you're right. It's not that Jesus is chastising them, saying, "Why did you not believe in me?" It's like you said, "Why didn't you think that we were going to be in this together, right? And that you can do this.
Right, you
That
have a big role, yeah.
You're in the storm with me, and don't doubt yourself and your capacity." And so I think if we flip it that way, then it's not like a condemnation. It's actually an invitation, to be fully who we are to be, and knowing that Jesus is right there with us in the storm, and then will be with us as things calm. And then when the storm rages again.
That's right. Yeah, and I love how the passage ends, because it makes me just think of the work we do together, and where we mix where not even mix, there isn't a distinction much between our faith, right? Our religious lives and political lives in many ways, right? It's all one and the same. And so I like after this whole scene, they get into the boat, it says, and they all worshiped him in the boat. I love that image in the middle of the lake, and everyone's having a church service all of a sudden. And it just reminds us of, we've been out, in the streets, and people and other, you see people that are taking their faith to the streets. Like it's not like I'm going to worship in church and then I'm going to go out and fight Leviathan in the streets, right? It's all one in the same. It's the same movement, a same gesture. And so I love this breaking down of the distinction between worship or our faith life or our religious life and our political life or our work of liberation, right? There is no distinction between that. It's just an enrichment of everything involved, which I really love that image.
Being out on the streets is part of our worship, and doing the work.
Amen.
Amen to that, brother.
Well, what do you think? We're going to call it?
I think it's good.
Okay.
I think it'll preach. I think there's enough for people to mess with, just like we just started.
Yeah, so if you do like what you hear here, please share it with a friend, and hopefully you do have something you can use to preach or talk about with your friends and family, or use in your speeches in the street, whatever. But we hope you'll join us again next week for Liberation Lectionary. Again, my name is Jaime Edwards Acton, and we got Francisco Garcia out in Nashville, Tennessee, and we'll see you next week. Peace.
Peace, everyone.